Welcome, 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 everyone. Just taking a few seconds here, as always with Zoom, let everybody in from the waiting room. So just another second or two here, make sure everyone has a chance to connect to audio, video if they'd like to. We always enjoy seeing everybody's face. All right, looks like we're doing pretty good. Wonderful. Well, good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. My name is Mike Kesmarchik, Adult Programs Developer at the Academy of Natural Sciences of Drexel University, virtually right here behind me. And this evening's program, Climate Risks from Headwaters to Coast, is a collaboration between Academy Town Square series and Drexel Climate Year series. We have two incredible Drexel faculty members with us tonight from a variety of disciplines, sharing their work through roughly 15-minute presentations. Unfortunately, one of our speakers was unable to make it due to a last-minute issue tonight. So we're going to shrink the program down closer to an hour instead of the hour and a half. So we'll have ample time to hear our two wonderful speakers, and then we will open it up for Q&A, for discussion, for any thoughts you might have, which you're welcome to throw into the chat throughout their presentations, and then we will get to as many as we can afterwards during the discussion part. It's now my pleasure to turn the spotlight over to my colleague and the organizer of Drexel Climate Year Speaker Series, Carenage.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you so much for collaborating with us. We're so excited to be collaborating with the Academy on this event tonight. My name's Corinne. I work in one of our speakers, Dr. Franco Montalto's lab, the Sustainable Water Resource Engineering Lab, and am one of the organizers behind Climate Year and the speaker series. This year, as part of Climate Year at Drexel and at the Academy, we're celebrating, supporting, and cataloging our ongoing climate work happening at all levels of the university and the Academy. And we're also launching new initiatives, such as the speaker series, to make combating climate change central to our institutional practices, curriculum, research, and civic engagement. This speaker series actually just started last month. We're highlighting work from different departments throughout Drexel and the Academy. Last month, we covered transportation, health, and climate from the perspectives of public health, sociology, and environmental engineering. Today, as you know, our focus is on water and resiliency through the lens of ecology and engineering. And then next month, our topic is on averting climate disaster, and our speakers come from the realms of technology, society, and politics. I'll share a link to register for that in the chat in a moment. Before we get started today, I just wanted to give a quick land acknowledgement. I have been on a personal journey to get more in touch with the indigenous roots of this region and learn more from a way of life that is more harmonic and balanced with nature. If you've also been on this journey, I encourage you to share any links or resources that you'd like to share with the participants tonight. You're welcome to throw some links in the chat if you like. And I'm just going to share a quick passage from the Nanticoke Lenni Lenape Tribal Nation as a small tribute of gratitude for their presence here in this region. The land upon which we gather is part of the traditional territory of the Lenni Lenape called Lenape Hoking. The Lenape people lived in harmony with one another upon this territory for thousands of years. During the colonial era and early federal period, many were removed west and north, but some also remain among the continuing historical tribal communities of the region. We acknowledge the Lenni Lenape as the original people of this land and their continuing relationship with the territory. In our acknowledgement of the continued presence of Lenape people in their homeland, we affirm the aspiration of the great Lenape chief Tamanend that there be harmony between the indigenous people of this land and the descendants of the immigrants to this land, as long as the rivers and creeks flow and the sun, moon, and stars shine. And with that, I will introduce our moderator, Erin Wright. Erin Wright is a senior undergraduate environmental studies and sustainability major who is minoring in public health and geoscience. She is currently finishing up her final co-op cycle as a research assistant at the Academy of Natural Sciences. She's working with Dr. Jocelyn Sessa and Brian Koester on studying the potential for pteropods to be used as proxies for ocean acidification. After graduation, Erin plans to pursue a career in environmental policy or law. And Erin, I pass the floor to you.
Thank you. So next I will introduce Dr. Stefanie Kroll. She is the Watershed Ecology Section Leader at the Academy of Natural Sciences and an Assistant Research Professor at Drexel. Her research focuses on biological indicators of ecosystem health in streams, the responses of aquatic communities to restoration and habitat protection, and the effects of climate change and other stressors from human activities. She's also Project Science Director for Delaware River Watershed Initiative, a collaborative effort among over 60 regional nonprofits to restore and protect regional waterways.
Thanks, Erin. And thank you, Corinne. I really appreciated that inspirational quote. And it's good that we're talking about water because we need the rivers to keep flowing, to keep trying to live in harmony with everyone who's in the Delaware Basin and beyond, of course. So I'm going to share my screen and, sorry, one moment. Here we go. So I am going to talk to you today about a project that just got funded last fall, and we got started here in the spring. So this is the beginning of the project, and we have so many questions, and I'm sure we're going to end up having even more questions as it progresses. And I'll just give you a background on why we proposed to do this work and why it might be important. Sorry, to go back. I do just want to acknowledge my great team collaborating with Stephen Ryer, who is at Bloomsburg University, and then Tanya Dapke, Marina Hurley, and Danielle Odom are really important to this work, and they work with me at the Academy of Natural Sciences. Resilience has so many definitions, and I think it gets used a lot for different things. And so just wanted to start out, I'm definitely somebody who is always saying, oh, you know what I mean, right? And no, scientists especially really need you to define what you're talking about. So trying to get in better practice there. We think about it like our well-being, right? I don't know, this woman getting hit by a cannon or a wrecking ball and is fine, that is extremely resilient. I don't know that we should expect that level with ourselves anymore. Another really big use of it in the environmental fields and is in our infrastructure. So dams, power plants, all of those resource supply infrastructures are often considered now in terms of climate change, and are they going to be resilient against pressures or just use over a long time? I, of course, will be focusing on things that are related to ecosystem structure and function. So groups of creatures that are interacting in an ecosystem and how those interactions make it resilient, but I will define resilience further. A lot of times, and historically in the literature on rivers, resilience has been used as either resistance or recovery. So resistance of a system means that it doesn't change, that it can take that disturbance and it can just persist as it is. And so then recovery is it gets disturbed, there is a change, but it changes relatively quickly back to its original state. So resilience requires us to consider both resistance and recovery. And one thing that can be difficult to think about is when we're studying streams, we want to know how they change from year to year. And a lot of times that's considered noise. It's considered, interannual variation, which it is, but it can also be an indicator of resilience because the identity of a system should be a little bit flexible so that it can absorb that disturbance. And if it changes, come back in a relatively short time. Resilience does not mean that the system is healthy necessarily. You can have a very degraded system that is very good at maintaining that status. And have an example here. The classic resilient system that isn't healthy is when we think about algal blooms. So a healthy state would be this nice clear lake, beautiful. You can see the bottom. There are lots of creatures there living in balance. And a different state is this eutrophied state, which means there's been a lot of nutrient inputs into it, and it gets overrun with algae and other primary producers. So this eutrophied state in the after picture can also be resilient. I think resilience is a very complicated topic, so I hope you don't mind me continuing to show you this next figure, because it took me a while and a lot of reading to really be able to understand what people mean by resilience. And so if you think of this before state over here where the ball is, and then the after state here, those are two different domains or states. And then the system can move between them. So this clear, nice lake could turn into this green guacamole bay. So the arrows represent disturbances, but it could also move back with recovery. And then we think about stability, which is, being in one certain way and how much return time it would need to go back to the previous state. A wider valley is that flexibility I talked about. So thinking about a system being able to bend without breaking. So I think all of these components have to be considered when we're thinking about resilience. So pardon the long definition, but so some factors that affect it are, is the system used to getting disturbed? If a system is relatively often disturbed, it is therefore resilient to that disturbance. So some streams, like you can see in the middle here, naturally dry up. They're ephemeral streams or temporary streams, and they are adapted to that. And you can find streams like this, well, in the Wissahickon, in dry areas. They're a pretty common occurrence because there's just not always water there. We expect this to get worse and there to be drying of streams that shouldn't be dried with climate change in some areas. But if a system is used to that type of disturbance, it can be resilient to it. But then if you add in a different type of disturbance, it does not mean it necessarily will also be resilient to the new disturbance. And a really big factor, a report just came out by the International Panel on Climate Change and the panel on biodiversity, that diversity is really a key and overlooked part of climate change resilience. So you've got a lot of creatures and they're all doing certain functions. You may have many creatures doing a similar function, and that is part of what will help a system be resilient. Last part of definitions, well, no, there's one more, are watersheds. You may already know this, but I do think it's a great idea just to remind folks that a watershed is the whole area of land that drains to rivers, streams, wetlands, and lakes. And then including those rivers and streams, wetlands, and lakes, the whole area draining, and often that ends in an ocean. There are examples of places that drain to a lake and never drain to an ocean, but most of the watersheds we know drain to oceans. And then here are the watersheds of the United States. So the map is showing the rivers, but it's blocked off also all the land that's draining to those rivers. So you can see, you might know this, the Mississippi watershed is the largest in the United States, and our lovely Delaware that we're studying is here in yellow. All right, last introduction or definition is, what are headwaters? Headwaters are tiny creeks, springs. They're on the hills and the mountains of watersheds. Usually, very often they're forested, but not always. And when they are forested, those forests filter rainwater and slow runoff coming from land into the creeks. So people often think like the headwaters are just up here in the places where the very tippy top of the watershed, but actually you've got headwaters in all areas of the watershed, which is any place a creek begins. And so, you know, they look like these small creeks. I'm sure we've got some fishermen here that know too well how beautiful headwaters can be. All right. Some relevant changes of climate change and the effects we expect to see on rivers and streams. We may expect an earlier spring, and insect life cycles depend on temperature. It's like the cumulative temperature from when they're in the egg stage through. Aquatic insects are in the water living for almost the whole year in an aquatic phase, and then they emerge as adults in the spring, summer, and fall. So that life cycle depends on temperature over the year. So if you increase temperatures, then they're going to come out earlier. When there's less ice and snow and also more precipitation, the timing and intensity of our river flows will be changing. When we increase the temperature, a lot of creatures have tolerance of temperature within a specific window. So some of them, it may get too warm. We really think about trout here, maybe some sculpin and mad tom can be affected by those high temperatures. And as I said, we may see more stream channel drying. And we do expect climate change to affect terrestrial things like agriculture and the growth of trees and soil moisture, as well as groundwater. So many ways that climate change is going to affect our rivers and streams. And here's just a drawing of snowfall, where we're expecting to see increases down here, decreases down here. Anywhere that orange is decreases and then blue are increases. Just to quickly say my work before this on climate change in Spain, this is Castilla-La Mancha, which you would have Madrid up over here, looking at aquatic insects and other creatures, which we call macroinvertebrates, and the number of taxa at the genus level that we might expect to disappear with a 1 degree increase in temperature and a decrease in precipitation. So in some of these streams in Spain, we might expect 9 to 13 out of about 25 taxa or creatures to be gone. So that's a lot. And that's an arid system. It's different from ours. It's Mediterranean. But so that was what I have worked on before. Just thinking again about what makes a community resilient, we consider structure and function. And so structure means who is there, what species, but also what is their genetic makeup? Do we have natural populations that are pretty diverse, that have that natural variability, or have the trout been stocked and so they have a very narrow genetic makeup? And then function, if you remember back to biology, phenotype means the observed characteristics. So for us, it's our hair color, our eye color. It might also be the way we use our hands and certain behaviors. Headwaters are not the most diverse places. Disturbance does tend to create diversity, and headwaters are pretty gentle places that don't have a whole lot of disturbance. But they do have unique creatures, and these creatures are sensitive to pollution. And so I alluded to this earlier, but when you have high biodiversity, is that insurance against disturbance, which means if you have several doing the same function or redundancy, does that mean you lose some of the sensitive ones, but the more tolerant ones can maintain that function? And when we think about biodiversity and resilience, how many is different than necessarily who. So although we love our trout, and I do hope we keep them, there may be a time in the future when the system cannot sustain them and some other creature has to step in and perform their function. We must always consider ourselves part of that system. When we think about function, so that was more on structure. For function, what does that even mean? So energy flow. which is usually who's eating whom and how much of the other are they eating, or what are they eating in terms of dead material. So going from obviously the sun, we've got primary producers that are plants and algae, our beloved diatoms, which I'll tell you about, are single-celled photosynthetic creatures. And then dead matter, you have scrapers that eat algae, you have organisms that eat the small pieces of organic matter, and then you have predators who are up there eating the other creatures. So that is the energy flow. Processing material. So not everything comes in an edible form. Leaves are more delicious when they're occupied by bacteria. So that's a function that bacteria have, is adding nutrition to the system. And so can we have identities of a stream that are the function and not just the structure? And we're looking at who eats what and in what amounts. And then when we think about energy flows and functions, there aren't great definitions of a healthy energy flow for a stream. And then of course, these functions accumulate downstream. So these are some questions we have. For resilience, as I said, we may have to give up some creatures' stability or their presence year after year to favor flexibility of many different creatures that are able to have the same function. And when they're changing from one year to the next, that may be a sign of resilience. But it's important to have the flows, the water chemistry, and the habitat as healthy as possible, and to have good connections to groundwater. So that's flowing into the creeks. And when we think about conservation, people often target a species for conservation. And so if that place is vulnerable, it means perhaps the habitat or that population are going to be in decline. And then some things may be irreplaceable, and this may be the future of some of our systems. All right, so I think I don't want to keep on this vein. I want to tell you more about our study, but I guess lastly, we just also, when we're preserving habitat, we need to address threats. We've got development threats, population growth in certain areas, pollution, and the ways we do that is protecting forests and restoring degraded areas. And so when we're doing that, we sometimes have a beautiful picture of how a system should be, but we also have to consider flexibility in a forest system. And so what I want to do is try to figure out, when I'm looking at these bugs and other creatures that we call macroinvertebrates, what are some ways I can characterize whether or not that group is resilient, that whole community is resilient? And looking at a small scale, at a stream reach, and then building up to what do we need in the small creeks and the tributaries and the headwaters to connect to the larger watershed. So here is our study as designed. We are using multiple indicators because they give us multiple measures of biodiversity, or the structure and the function. So this picture here are diatoms that I mentioned that are single-celled photosynthetic creatures. And then biofilms are that yummy paste that gets on leaves. And when you slip on a rock, you are slipping on algae, bacteria, and the goo around them, which is actually a delicious sugary substance full of nutrients for anything that eats it. And so those are going to help us understand some of the primary production, photosynthesis, and what food is at the base of our food chain in the creeks. Macroinvertebrates, which are insects, snails, worms, things like that. We're going to identify them the old-fashioned way, which is looking at them under a scope and using keys. So that's using their morphology, their shape. And then we're going to use some more innovative technology, DNA metabarcoding, which is we clip off a piece of them and send it away. And those people in the lab throw it in a blender, extract their DNA, and then put it through a machine which contains information on the DNA of all known aquatic insects, and they come out and tell us which insect it is. So we'll look at it, and then we'll also use its DNA to identify it. This is really key because Aquatic insects, as I mentioned, spend most of their life in the water, but they're not mature. And so they're not reproducing. And it's the reproductive structures that help us identify them to species. Because honestly, so many of them just look so alike. And you can imagine, you know, they're this big, they're this big, they're this big. And getting in there and looking at this hair is this way and this gill is this way, we might miss some important factor that defines them as a species. So and really what it comes down to is the hardware for reproduction. So because we only look at the juveniles and not the adults, we don't necessarily get them to species, and the DNA will tell us when we haven't. I'm happy to answer more questions about that if I didn't describe it well. For function, we're looking at the metabolism of the stream. Metabolism is like respiration, like we take in oxygen and then food and we produce energy. So everything that's a consumer is respiring, and everything that's a producer, like a plant, is producing through photosynthesis. And the balance between these two can be analyzed by measuring temperature and oxygen. So that will help us understand the overall functioning of the system. And then one really fun technology that's still being worked out is called environmental DNA, or eDNA, where you grab a water sample and you send it to a similar lab, and anything that has DNA in that water sample, or you can do it with soil, anything there, they will tell you, hey, we found all these different creatures that are somewhere upstream of here, and their DNA was in this water sample. So you can imagine all the possibilities of that. And we're still working out how to use it best, but what we're looking for are sensitive fishes and mussels. I'm sure I'm running a little long. Nobody has pulled me off the stage yet, but I just want to say we have so many questions, and the study is funded by the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation and the Pennsylvania DEP, who are really interested in the biodiversity and if these systems may be resilient to climate change. But there are so many questions we can ask about what are these metrics of resilience, that comparison of morphology, of looking at the bug and DNA. What is that hidden biodiversity that we're missing, and what information can that add? And can we relate all the data that I showed you to think of the whole ecosystem within that stream and the whole system's resilience? And then so the applications of this are using environmental DNA to detect rare species, especially mussels. They're incredibly endangered. They're the most endangered group of creatures in the world. And we have many in the Delaware Basin, but you have to look for them. They're sparse. And if you pick one up, it had a very nice place to live. That mussel might be 100 years old. And when you put it down, is it safe there, or did you just disturb it and kind of ruin its life? So if we could do this with eDNA, we could protect them even more by not looking for them directly. And then, are there very sensitive fishes, mussels, insects, salamanders in areas where no one's ever seen them? And then the application might be to help better protect watersheds and use environmental DNA and other of these technologies to identify streams that might be more or less vulnerable to climate change. I know I hit you with a lot there. I'm happy to answer questions now, or if you want to send me an email, I'm happy to answer them later. And thanks for this opportunity.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kroll, for that. That was a really interesting talk you gave just now. So next I'll be introducing Dr. Franco Montalto, and he is a civil and environmental engineer who works on water resource problems in urban and urbanizing context. He is a professor in Drexel's College of Engineering in the Department of Civil, Architectural, and Environmental Engineering, and also the president and founder of eDesign Dynamics, an environmental and water resources consulting firm based in New York City. After working extensively in the fields of urban ecological restoration, green infrastructure, and urban sustainability for the last 25 years, he has recently transitioned to focus on how these activities can be integrated into larger resilience strategies for cities in the context of climate change.
Thank you, Erin. let me share my screen, one moment. Okay, hopefully that is clear. You can see that. Okay, I'm assuming you can hear.
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
thank you. Thanks. Thanks to the organizers for this event. This is really exciting, and thanks, Erin, for the introduction, and thanks to the previous speaker for Steph for introducing this concept of resilience, which is something that I think all of us are working more and more on in whatever discipline we find ourselves. So I'm, as was mentioned, a water resources engineer, and I've spent a lot of time working on ecological restoration of wetlands in particular, and water resource questions in particular surrounding stormwater. But recently, and probably not coincidentally, I found myself working flooding questions. And flooding are one of those disturbances that Steph mentioned that can really disrupt the equilibrium of a system. And so I've been working lately on trying to bring together all of the work that I've done in ecological restoration and on green infrastructure and stormwater planning into the context of flood risk reduction in urban coastal communities. So that's the focus of my talk. So what, let me just figure out why this is not advancing. Okay. So what I thought I would do is just talk a little bit about the different types of flooding, because we hear a lot about flooding, but if you're in the business of trying to reduce the risk of flooding, it's important to do some forensics and to figure out what is causing the flooding. And there are a variety of different causes. So I thought I would start by just talking about the causes, the different types of floods that we see. And then the challenge that these various dynamics play or create for coastal areas, and specifically their population and the infrastructure that's there. And then I thought, to make it a little bit more interesting, I would talk about a case study. This is a project in Grenada that I've been involved in over the past few years as part of a Green Climate Fund project. And I thought that would be an interesting way to kind of talk about the challenge and the opportunities. So there are a number of different reasons why it floods. And so one of the most common floods that we hear about are fluvial floods. And that, if you look at this watershed on the right, you see a bunch of rivers going down to the bay. This happens to be in Grenada. A fluvial flood is when some portion of one of these rivers or streams overflows its banks, and you get flooding along the side of the river. That's a fluvial flood. And that's different from a coastal flood. A coastal flood occurs when, either because of strong winds or storm surges or an exceptionally high tide, you get a flood wave coming in from the coast and inundating a portion of the coastal plain. And so you can already see that the causes of those two types of floods differ significantly. Then there's pluvial flooding. So when it rains, the rate at which the water is coming out of the atmosphere and hitting the ground is called the precipitation intensity. And if you think about a forest or a wetland or any kind of a porous surface, there's a certain capacity of that surface to intake the precipitation. And in fact, in an impervious surface, a roof or a street, you have no ability, no capacity to infiltrate the water. But even in a completely pervious surface, in a completely natural watershed, there's a certain infiltration capacity of the land. And when you have an intense rain event, where the intensity at which the precipitation is being applied to the land exceeds the capacity of the soil to absorb it, then you get pluvial flooding. And this has nothing to do with coastal flooding. It has nothing to do with the rivers or lakes or streams. It has to do simply with the fact that the water is coming out of the air and hitting the ground faster than it can be absorbed. And of course, then it accumulates on the land surface and causes a flood. And then there's a specific sort of subset of pluvial flooding, which I'm calling urban pluvial flooding, because of course in urban landscapes, we have a lot of impervious surfaces that do not infiltrate, and we built drainage infrastructure over 100 years or more that diverts that water. It puts it into a drain, into a pipe, into some kind of a conduit. And those features, just like the soil, have a certain capacity to convey water. And so if the rain is generated at a rate that cannot be absorbed in your storm drains, then you have a certain type of urban pluvial flooding, where the water just accumulates on impervious surfaces in cities and can't drain away fast enough even with the infrastructure that's in place. And finally, and this is the really challenging part of this, we have compound flooding. We have situations where all of these things or some combination of these things could be happening at the same time. So you could have an intense rainstorm happening at an extremely high tide or as part of a storm event that has very high winds. And so in this map on the right here, you could have a lot of rain falling on the watershed and a storm surge coming in from the coast. And that water is meeting in this coastal area. Or you could have a really intense precipitation that's causing pluvial flooding all over this landscape at the same time that the coast is being inundated by a high tide. And these compound conditions are particularly challenging to plan for. And we're seeing more and more of these kinds of compound conditions. So if we were in an undeveloped landscape, and here's a picture of wonderful Scotland, and you see an undeveloped floodplain, and you see this sort of braided stream channel with plains and wetlands all around it. And this is the way nature deals with these conditions. The river, which ordinarily might flow in a very well-defined channel or a channel that meanders over time, but is still well-defined at any point in time, can overflow its banks into a plain, which we call a floodplain, an area that can safely flood. And you can see how all of a sudden this area, which currently is just this channel, if it were to flood, you would now have this entire width available for conveying the flow. And so that's what happens in nature. But if we look at an urbanized landscape, and this is a place where this was my first job actually working in the New Jersey Meadowlands. This is a watershed where I did a lot of wetland restoration work. And if you look at this floodplain, this happens to be the Hackensack River, and you look at all of the features that we have here. We have stadiums, we have contaminated, this is Berries Creek Canal, which is one of the most mercury contaminated water bodies. You have rail lines, you have residential neighborhoods, you have commercial centers, you have highways, you have wastewater treatment plants, you have communications infrastructure. And you even have, this is a project that I worked on, an ecological restoration site, but all of these features are now sort of fixed in the floodplain and can't be moved. And if any of those features get flooded, they could be damaged. And so when you think about the difference between the undeveloped floodplain and the developed floodplain, you can start to see the challenge that we have from an engineering perspective. So further exacerbating these risks in these urbanized or developed floodplains are a few factors. So the first is that, of course, sea level is rising, storm surges are occurring. We have changes in the amount and intensity of precipitation. And in fact, what we're seeing is a greater frequency of intense precipitation events. And then you've got coastal urban development, like I showed in the previous slide. And I just want to sort of point out that we've always liked to live near the coast for food, for navigation, for protection, for commerce, many other reasons. Many of our cities are along coasts. But today, globally, urbanization in these low elevation coastal zones is advancing faster than elsewhere. And that's globally, but even in some of the urbanized areas of the United States, for example, we've got extensive urbanization in the coastal zone. Almost 2/3 of the world's cities with populations over 5 million are located in these areas that are at significant risk of sea level rise. So that brings me to the question of what do we do about this? So we've got a lot of infrastructure in the coastal zone. We're committed to that infrastructure. It's difficult to imagine collapsing that infrastructure or moving that infrastructure. and yet the flood risks are getting greater. And so we can think about a series of different strategies for reducing coastal flood risks. One is a protection strategy, and these tend to be very expensive measures, but in localized situations, we can build various kinds of seawalls and barriers to protect assets that are in the coastal zone that we don't want to flood. We can retreat, and in fact, even this week, there's a conference at Columbia University on managed retreat, moving away from the coast. It's sort of giving up and moving back, but retreat can be very problematic for communities that are committed or have historical ties to a particular place. Do we want to retreat? And then there's this sort of larger strategy of accommodate. Are there ways to allow flooding to occur within this built coastal environment in a way that's not problematic? Can we actually, and this is sometimes known as adaptation, it's sometimes known as resilience to, develop resilience to these changing conditions. So what I wanted to do is introduce this word, obdurate, which is stubbornly refusing to change one's opinion or course of action. And this very much describes sort of the approach that we've had to infrastructure. We build things, we want them to stay there, we want them to stay in their current sort of function, and we don't want to be flexible. And this sort of forces a question. Can we retrofit this obdurate infrastructure? I mean, look at these features that I'm showing in these two images. Can we retrofit this fixed infrastructure so that it's safe to flood? And even with the uncertainty about how much compound flood risks will change in the future, can we avoid producing more obdurate infrastructure in these places? And so I've been sort of thinking a lot about this from a design perspective. And I wanted to, this gets into the last part of the presentation, I wanted to talk about this case study. This was a Green Climate Fund project in the island nation of Grenada in the West Indies. And I was involved as a consultant. And our focus was to look at a few key locations within the country of Grenada that are at risk to flooding, and to help develop what was called a climate smart strategy for adapting them to these future risks. So I wanted to talk a little bit about just one of those projects. This is the Carenage in St. George's, which is the capital of Grenada. It's sort of the pearl of the island. It's the historic center of activity on the island. And it is at risk. It is already flooding regularly due to a variety of different events, both precipitation and coastal driven events. And here are just some images that we produced as part of the initial phases of this study. This is in looking down at the Carenage, at this capital city. And this was when we collected tidal data in 2018. But if you add the projections for sea level rise, you'll see 2020s, the 2050s, the 2080s, you'll see how much of, and in particular, this coastal road that the capital city relies on for a whole bunch of things, from emergency services to resources, going underwater. And here you can see it. This is that coastal road in cross section. This is high tide today. And when we fast forward, here's where high tide, just a regular high tide in 2050 and 2080, never mind a storm surge on top of that. And you can begin to see what the problems can be for this capital city. So we developed a concept, and here's a situation where retreat is essentially impossible, right? This is the capital of the island. It's historic, it's beautiful. It's really where the country would like to see tourists coming. So retreat is a really difficult concept to consider in this place. Protection, building a barrier over here, is extremely expensive proposition. And so what we wanted to look at was a strategy for protecting this coastal road and these properties along the coast from the surges and the sea level rise that are coming in, but also to think about what happens when there's extensive precipitation. These slopes on the side are really steep. And so when it rains, there's water racing down towards the coast. And so I'll just show you a couple of images from this. This is one particular location where we proposed sort of building out from the coastal road into the water and creating a series of walkways, gathering spaces, sort of market spaces and seating that actually serve a purpose as a barrier. You know, when we think about a barrier, it often sounds very, very cold. You know, you're on one side of the barrier, you're on one side of the wall, you can't see the other side. And that was not possible for this sort of capital city. So what we thought about, and this is on the sort of road side of the barrier, was creating a situation where people could actually, the top of the barrier becomes somewhat of a promenade, and people can get there from the coastal road and walk up. And who would ever know that this is actually protecting that coastal city from a surge in 2100. But on the other side, on the top, you can see sort of, you can create a walkway and some gathering spaces. But on the other side, you can actually design the edge of this wall so that it actually promotes access, which was another goal of the project, makes it easier for people coming from inside to dock and to come up into the city. But it doesn't solve the problem of what happens when it rains. This is kind of looking at this, and you can see the hills in the background. And when it rains, you've now got water coming up, coming down, and would be trapped behind the wall. And so here's sort of like the pathways that runoff flows when it rains. And this is that area that I was just talking about. So we had to develop a strategy for intercepting the precipitation, the runoff that's generated when it rains. So here we're taking underneath this road, which is higher up on the hill. We're collecting the stormwater and diverting it around this area and sending it right out into the sea, where the rainfall that's falling on the downstream side of that wall is now gathered in underneath this walkway. This is the same walkway that I was just showing, in some empty areas, empty volumes. And so we've sized these specifically so that the runoff that's generated in that upslope area is gathered here when it rains, and then after it stops raining can be pumped out. And so this was kind of an interesting concept for us to work on, because we're really addressing compound flooding, the surges coming in from the coast, and the pluvial and in this case also fluvial flooding coming from the upland areas in this multifunctional piece of infrastructure that allows the city to continue to be vibrant and to have this coastal culture that it so depends on. So I'll just end with a couple of questions that I think we need to think about in general. How committed are we to existing coastal developments? How important are the cities that we built along the coast to us? How much do we want to stay there? Do we want to stay there at all costs, or are we willing to move? I think those are some really high-level questions that we need to think about before we invest a lot of money in protection. Can we successfully design infrastructure that's safe to flood? But then, you know, this larger question, how committed are we to existing upstream developments? In many cases, if in the case where it's runoff generated in the headwaters that's creating problematic conditions down at the coast, I would say there are questions that we might want to ask about whether compound flood risks that we find down in the coastal city could be avoided by doing watershed restoration up higher in the watershed. And that could be really complex when you think of different municipal boundaries, different demographics, different groups, who lives in the coast, who lives upstream. There are some really difficult questions to ask there. Or, you know, does this watershed restoration, is that not really going to solve the problem? Because the coastal causes of the flooding are too great. And then finally, like, how will our coastal ecosystems evolve? I mean, I'm talking about people, but wetlands and other types of coastal ecosystems naturally, historically, over thousands and thousands of years, have moved backwards and forwards, up and down in the topography in response to sea level rise. But when we have these fixed features in the landscape, it's very difficult, or in many cases impossible, for those ecosystems to move. So how will they evolve, or will they cease to exist? And I'll just end and say, you know, I've introduced a lot here, but I'm really interested in these discussions, and would love to interact with anyone on any of these questions. But this is an image from Elizabeth Rush, her book, Dispatches from the New American Coast. I learned this word, rampike, which I didn't know, but I had seen pictures like this, or I had seen trees like this, trees in coastal areas that are just dead and standing because of encroaching salinity, because of rising sea level, adding salinity to the root zone of these trees that can no longer live there. And we're beginning to see more and more of these rampikes as sort of a warning to us that we need to really think about how these factors are going to play out going forward. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Dr. Montalto. So now we're going to go into the discussion. So if anyone has any questions, feel free to post that in the chat. But to start off, so someone in the chat, like in the audience, asked about azolifers and how they could safely, if they could be safely introduced into infrastructure, like buildings in green cities, to help with reducing carbon dioxide emissions. Are you familiar with those? I haven't heard about them personally, but yeah, so I'm not sure if.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with azolifers. I don't know, Steph, is that one that you're?
No, now I really want to know more. So I'm sorry, I can't answer it either.
But I will say that there's a lot of interesting innovation in green building design. You know, there's now building integrated photovoltaics. I mean, we've had solar panels for a long time, but there's, you know, we've also had for a long time the ability to integrate into the facade of the buildings, the ability to generate energy. We're seeing green facades, we're seeing green walls, we're seeing all types of, you know, people thinking vertically about vertical surfaces as opposed to just the horizontal surfaces. So although I'm not familiar with that particular fern, you know, this strategy of incorporating vegetation into the built environment is one that we really need to be thinking about seriously.
Yeah, so like I also like personally I wonder like with green roofs and like the concern for like moisture against like infrastructure. I'm interested like knowing how the industry is like coming like working around that, like extra vegetation.
Well, green roofs are specially designed. You know, you first build a regular roof, and you've got a membrane roof that's protecting, insulating the building from the vegetation, and then you have various layers, including the growing media and the vegetation. So, actually, the green roofs tend to protect the conventional roof that's underneath them because they provide a degree of insulation. And so, you know, as the temperature goes up and down outside, the you know, if there was no vegetation, the temperature of the roof surface would go up and down, and that sort of expansion contraction eventually wears down the roof. But with the vegetation on top of it, you provide a degree of thermal buffering, and you can actually extend the length of the useful life of the roof surface. But there are ways of designing around the moisture considerations on rooftops.
Oh, okay, thank you. And someone also was asking, so will the Philadelphia airport need to be moved due to flooding?
Well, you know, there is, I'm not going to say it needs to be moved, but if you look at the sea level rise projections going forward, the risk of flooding at the airport is getting greater. And so, you know, as I mentioned, you know, moving the airport is that second category, right? That's retreat. That would be saying, all right, impossible to protect. You know, there's a discussion that has to happen about whether you try to protect, elevate, accommodate. Are there ways that you could raise things at the airport? I'm not directly involved in anything at the airport. I'm not working on any projects there, but you know, before jumping to does the airport need to move, there are questions about you know, various alternatives that would need to be considered, and you know, in a cost benefit perspective to see But the sea level rise projections on the Delaware are significant, and the airport is certainly at risk.
Okay, thank you. And I see Kimberly has their hand raised.
Sorry, Kimberly.
There we go. No, I just had a quick problem with the unmuting. My question was in regards to obviously some of the infrastructure and some of the coastal areas in regards to industrial and such. And I've seen more and more hard surfaces being designed to deal with runoff, particularly let's say the concrete that becomes more porous in using that in roads and floodplains and such. Does this help alleviate or more kind of push the problem, or is this can you work with surface materials even if they aren't harder surface materials, particularly like the porous concretes, in still maintaining those industrialized areas, let's say the airport, but allowing them to better target flooding or target dispersing the water to make those areas less prone to being inundated? Or do you still have to deal with, truthfully, where the water goes at some point or another?
Well, so permeable pavements are as you mentioned, there are ways of designing the pavement. There's porous pavers, there's porous concrete, there's porous asphalt, such that you can pour a bucket of water on the pavement and the water goes in. There are challenges associated with the wearability of those surfaces. So in a parking lot, you might use permeable pavement, but you typically don't see permeable pavement, say on a highway, a heavily trafficked area, or a place where you've got trucks that are making turns. So, if the flood risk is a pluvial flood risk, it's due to intense precipitation, I'm sure there's large areas of impervious surfaces in airports that could be designed to be permeable, not necessarily where the planes are taking off and landing, because those may be the wear and tear on those types of surfaces might be greater. But on the other hand, if the risk of flooding has to do with sea level rise and surges, all the permeable pavement in the world won't help you, because there's an almost unlimited amount of water that would be inundating the surfaces from the Delaware River, and the permeable pavement won't help you. So that's why I wanted to sort of start by saying that I think it's really important when we're looking at how to reduce flood risk to look at what's causing the flood risks, and then look at the technologies and the infrastructure typologies that we have available to us, and then think about how they can be used to help. But certainly, within, if you are a commercial strip mall development and you've got a huge parking lot, of course, and if it floods there because of urban pluvial limitations, right? It rains really heavily and that water can't up the storm drains, then permeable pavement could really be very helpful. So it really depends on the context.
All right, thank you. And the next question is to Dr. Kroll. So for the Headwaters study, is there an approach defined yet on selecting the streams for study? It sounds like a fascinating project.
Thanks for that question. So my dog is barking downstairs. What we wanted to do was look at really healthy headwaters, because those are the areas that are keeping the watershed healthy by supplying it with that first and all of those little tips, which can make up 80% of the watershed. So we wanted to find healthy forested watersheds. And we started off just by searching for areas where we wouldn't have a whole lot of confounding factors, which just means that in our study, you want to reduce the like, well, what if it's this other thing? Like maybe it's not the conditions here of forest, but maybe it's the wetlands or the amount of houses. So we wanted to keep some of those conditions constant. and then relatively small headwaters. And we also are going to meet with stakeholders at the Pennsylvania Fish and Boat Commission, the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection, and see if they have areas where they're interested in finding out, are there vulnerable mussels, fish, or insects, and are there places that they want to know about as well. So this year we sampled half of the streams, and then we'll meet again with our stakeholders and look at the other half. And we're also working with a policy expert who is seeing what is the current protection on the streams that we're studying, and are there other streams where they may be at risk of not being protected that perhaps we should study in order to inform if they need better protection. That's how we've chosen them so far. And then landowners have to say yes, which is actually can be tricky.
Got it. Thank you. And so we have another question for you, actually. So how do you know what is the right resilience? So should we interfere with algal blooms to help reach a different stable state?
Thanks. Yeah, so we do want our waterways to be healthy. So we definitely want to reduce algal blooms, because if they were just like another state that brought a whole different group of organisms, then we may have to say, oh, well, that's how it is now. But specifically with algal blooms, we know that the ecosystem is unhealthy when there are a lot of algae and plants, right? We know they produce oxygen. So they're out there all day producing oxygen. But then at night when there's no sun, they're not producing oxygen. And in fact, they're consuming some of it. So then you have these oxygen like increases and dips that can be very lethal. And at night, there can be overuse of oxygen so that the waterway has very little oxygen, cannot support those species that require high oxygen. And so that's why algal blooms are such a problem. They've got too many nutrients, which feed too many plants and algae. So we can avoid that. The project I work on, the Delaware River Watershed Initiative, works with a lot of other regional groups that, you know, our nutrient sources are wastewater treatment plants that don't remove nutrients, and farming. So we know pretty much how we can treat areas and reduce nutrient inputs from farms and wastewater. And so that is a preventable state if we just do that work.
Thank you. And just a follow-up question to that. So does the Academy of Natural Sciences and the university have goals or future plans to decrease flooded risks and take care of the area by Philadelphia rivers?
I guess we're researchers, so we want to inform protection and we want to advocate for it. But we don't directly protect, but we do work with partners who ask us questions that we can help them answer by collecting data, and then they can work with their stakeholders on greater protections.
Okay. And then I have one more question for you specifically. So with your work, like with the watersheds, now obviously like they cross between different state borders, and I'm just wondering like how, like what challenges have you encountered with differing state policies regarding your work, or if you have even encountered challenges with that?
Yeah, every state has their own way of defining streams. Nationwide, there's something called the designated use. So that says how healthy is this stream, and then therefore what can we use it for? The least strict designated use is drinking water, which you might at first be like, oh my God, what are we drinking? But actually what happens is with drinking water, the water goes into the water treatment plant. So starting out, it doesn't have to be excellent, because once it goes through the treatment plant, it is excellent. And then next is recreation, because you're not directly drinking the water, but you might splash some of it on you. And then next down is aquatic life use. So the strictest, highest level of designated use is by the fish and the insects that live there. But each state has a different way of classifying that. So some streams in Pennsylvania are exceptional value or high quality that are really highly protected. But those in New York State might be a trout fishery. In New Jersey, it might be trout reproduction or trout stocking. And so they're getting at the same thing, but they do classify them differently. And then therefore, they also have policies that protect them differently. So in Pennsylvania, exceptional value streams, if you want to develop like a ski resort or a water park near a lot of headwaters, you have to fill out, or an apartment building or a garage, you have to fill out certain paperwork that talks about the impact you're going to have on the stream, and the permit approvers, which are the Department of Environmental Protection, may say, no, you can't do that project, or you can do it, but you have to do these certain things. But they're not equally protected in every state, and they're not always perfectly assigned a designated use either. So often they get upgraded or downgraded based on data that are collected. So it can be tricky, and putting the data together can also just be tricky just to evaluate all of them in a similar way.
All right, thank you for answering that. There's a lot of information there. And they're actually, Kimberly just asked another question. So they asked, what countries are really more at the forefront of making some of the most dynamic policy changes for clean waters?
Wait, that's a great question that I don't know the answer to. I can say, and Franco, you might know a lot about this too. In Europe, they have the Water Framework Directive, and it's amazing where they are trying to get all the member states to assess all of their waterways and then to improve them. Originally, their goal was by 2025, but I'm sure they're behind schedule, even though it's a really ambitious international program with really good planning and communication. And so I think that that's a wonderful standard, because not only across counties and states, which we can struggle with sometimes in the United States, they're doing it across all of these different countries and all the regions within them.
Yeah, I don't know that I have a specific country either, but I do know that I've been looking abroad for examples, and there are great examples from lots of countries. There are great examples in Europe, but there's also great examples in other parts of the world that, I think of it more on a local basis. There might be a watershed that has historically developed in a really interesting way, or a city, or, so I don't know. There's examples from all over the place. And in fact, what I've been doing and what I'm involved in right now is gathering, I'm on the New York City panel on climate change, and I'm the co-chair of their flooding task force. So we actually have just started a international search for examples of specifically on the flooding question of how flooding is being addressed in different places. But there are examples, I keep finding examples in new places, and I'd be hard pressed to say one country in particular.
Thank you. And Shay?
Thank you. I just had to unmute. This is for Mr. Montalto. I had a question about regarding retreat. It's my understanding that on FEMA buyout properties, it's discouraged to plant trees. So first, could you correct me if that's wrong and you haven't heard that? But also, wouldn't planting the trees, and I mean, I'm thinking more along streams, but wouldn't that increase the capacity for infiltration or reduce pluvial flooding? And I think it's that trees could fall and then go downstream and become a public risk or public health risk.
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't know the answer to your first question about FEMA buyout properties being, and tree planting being discouraged there. But I can say that FEMA flood maps, are typically looking at the coastal flood risk. And so, tree, no tree, won't affect, if you have a surge that's this high, and the land is here, whether or not there's a tree on it, it's still going to be underwater. But trees, trees can provide a number of different benefits in specifically with the pluvial flood risks. I mean, of course, canopies can intercept rain, but that's most meaningful for small amounts of rain, right? Once you have a really big hurricane, the canopy gets saturated and the water comes through. But the roots of the trees can help prevent erosion and hold the soil in place, which can then, help to create other benefits. So trees are great. There's all kinds of reasons to have trees. I just don't know the answer to your question about whether on FEMA buyout properties, they don't want you to plant trees. I don't know the answer to that question. I'll look into it.
Thank you. And so our final question is for both of you. And so addressing climate change will take all hands on deck, and we need to be collaborating towards solutions. Are you seeing interdisciplinary teams coming together to address climate change?
Steph, do you want to go first, or?
Sure. I guess I'll say there are specific calls of funders like NSF for resilience in multidisciplinary groups. And NSF is the National Science Foundation, and they provide really high profile academic grants to do research. And so they're sort of the gold standard for what's important in research now. And so it's very encouraging to see them looking for groups to work together. I'll say the projects I'm involved with all have someone who works on policy in addition to us biologists, because some people are doing theoretical research, and that is also very important. But I'm a much more practical researcher, so I want to make sure that what I'm doing is grounded in people's concerns, policy issues, and that in some way it could be used. I can't guarantee that a policymaker is going to use what I provide, but by working with policy experts and collaborating with these agencies that govern our rivers, at least they'll have the information, and they are interested. It's in the state. There are state action plans around climate change, and they care about infrastructure and all kinds of questions, but they also care about the resilience of our waterways. So in my research, I don't do research unless somebody is involved who might have a connection in a decision-making body. And I am seeing this for a lot of collaborators as well. It's much more frequent than, the people who are just studying the reproduction of a single mayfly, for example.
Yeah, and I'll say in my sort of practice and research, what's new now is my collaboration with climate scientists. I would say, for my whole career, I've worked on sustainability questions. And as you know, sustainability has the three components: the ecological, the economic, and the social. And so I've worked for a long time with community groups on the social side and with natural scientists like biologists, ecologists, soil scientists on the ecological side, and on the economic side with policymakers and other folks who, think about finance. But what's new for me working on resilience projects is now adding in this non-stationarity, the fact that we're designing for a future that is uncertain. And it's difficult. The global climate models that are used to make these projections that we hear about in the news are just that. They're global climate models. They're looking at the whole planet. They can tell you big picture things that are happening. But if it comes down to like one particular property or one particular neighborhood, the global climate models give you a range of potential futures. And it's hard to, as an engineer, to know exactly what condition to design for. And so what has happened in my field is that now I'm working with climate scientists who tell me the probability of a future situation occurring. There's this much of a probability that we'll have a high tide of this height. And there's this much of a probability that it'll be this height. Or there's this much of a probability that we'll have this condition happening at the same time as this condition. And once you get these probabilities, you can turn them into risk factors, and then you can have an informed discussion with your client, with your community, with your policymaker about what to plan for. So to me, the interdisciplinarity that's new is this sort of interaction with people who think about the climate system and who specifically tell us how variable and how probabilistic certain situations are. But absolutely, I think we're not going to make any progress if we don't get much better at sort of bringing all of these different perspectives to bear on the development of solutions.
I also just want to follow up. I think that's really fascinating that you have to jump across those disciplines. Franco, you also mentioned that you had already worked with community groups, but I do want to bring that up as that's not the standard for all scientists. And too often, scientists take a look at a system and decide what the problems are. But the truth is, our communities are very well versed in what their concerns are about the environment and how it affects them. So I also think that is growing across all disciplines involved in climate change effects, is connecting back to the community and trying to be serving their communities and getting the communities to ask what are their concerns, what are their questions and their needs for this kind of work.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. The communities know what they want and they know what they've been through, and the policymakers and the designers and the researchers and everyone else who wants to help really can't help unless you start by listening to the community and building the knowledge that comes from the community into your formulation of solutions or your dialogue about solutions, because otherwise it's a top down and it needs to really be a bottom up. So yeah, absolutely.
All right, thank you so much. I want to, again, you guys had very fascinating talks and you brought up, some amazing points. And I also want to thank the audience for submitting some really good questions, and they were very thought-provoking, and we appreciate you all for coming. So there will be a recording of this event, and it'll be sent out to everybody who registered through Eventbrite. And now I'll hand it over to Mike.
Thank you so much, Erin. And I just want to reiterate, thank you, Erin, right, our fantastic student moderator for tonight. Thank you, Dr. Stefanie Kroll, Dr. Franco Montalto, for taking your time to come out to share your insight, your knowledge, and your evenings with us. A big shout out to Franco, who's taking time out of his vacation for us, which I think is especially awesome. I do want to share real quickly, this will all go out in the recording. I'm going to throw our links for upcoming programs for Academy Town Square. I made a mistake the first time I posted the link on the date. It is 7/29, our next Climate Year Drexel Speaker Series. Big thanks to Corinne for organizing those, is coming up as well on the 22nd of July. And as Erin said, thank you to the audience for joining us tonight. Climate change is a clear and present danger, and it takes not just awareness, but action and caring. And by taking your time out tonight, by joining us, by opening discussion lines, by sharing knowledge, that is action. And it's people like you joining us tonight that are going to make things better. So thank you for that, sincerely. Once again, thank you to Erin, Steph, Franco, Corinne. Have a wonderful night, everyone. Take care of yourselves, take care of each other, and we'll see you at the next Town Square and the next Drexel Climate Year Speaker Series. Good night.
Bye, thanks.